Volvo first introduced the cross-country badge in 1997 to give their wagons and crossover more SUV-like characters and capabilities. But now with this, the S60 cross-country, they're doing it for the very first time with a sedan body form. But it's not for the first time that a manufacturer's actually tried this, beefing up a sedan to emulate an SUV. AMC did it in the 80s, Subaru tried it in the early 2000s, but none of the models really succeeded. But now, Volvo thinks that the time is right, and more importantly, the place is right. Volvo thinks that the S60 Cross Country could be the perfect solution for the discerning Indian luxury car buyer. But is it really? Let's you and me get to the bottom of it. The S60 sedan has been in its second generation since 2010, but when you look at it even today, the design just doesn't seem like it's past its life cycle. It is still just as contemporary and pleasing as its rejuvenated German rivals, to say the least. Volvo's new approach to automotive design back then seems to have held its own. So what does the cross-country version entail apart from the obvious badges? Well, it's got the same kind of cross-dressing that you've even seen on a few hatchbacks in India. The claddings, the bumper guards, et al. But I'm sure you've guessed that the biggest change is in fact how high it sits off the ground. So what's the real story here? Well, it's all about the ground clearance, and it's something that's very important for us Indians, right? So I have with me a comparison chart. Let's talk about the cars that the S60 sedan was up against, starting with the Audi A4, which stands at 128 mm of ground clearance. The BMW 3 Series and the Mercedes-Benz C-Class were slightly better at 157 mm of ground clearance. So clearly the cross-country badge at least owes it to the S60 to give it enough ground clearance to match up to these sedans. But is it enough to match up to entry-level SUVs? So let's talk about those. You have the Audi Q3 standing at 170 mm of ground clearance, the Mercedes-Benz GLA class at 183 mm, and the BMW X1 at 193 mm. So what's the ground clearance of the Volvo S60 cross-country like? Well, it stands at 201 mm. So clearly that is a lot of ground clearance. That also means increase in ride height. But is that increase in ride height going to affect the dynamics? That's the part that we need to find out. When I see the interiors of the S60, I really like them like I did when it was launched first. But right here, let me bring some parallels from Mercedes-Benz, for example. Now, after the S-Class, when the C-Class was launched, you could see a lot of the technology, a lot of the features, a lot of the materials and the finishing from the S-Class percolated down to the C-Class. And now that I've seen the new Volvo XC90 and I know what Volvo is capable of, you know, despite the fact that I really liked the interiors as such, but what's letting down the S60's interiors are the fact that I know what Volvo is capable of now. Like the exteriors and the interiors, the engine isn't brand new either, so you have the same familiar 2.4 litre 5-cylinder D4 diesel engine, turbo diesel engine, which is now down-tuned to 190 horsepower from the 215 that you had in the sedan. It has an all-wheel drive system as standard, so that's once again to make sure that this car has the capabilities of traversing across terrains that the S60 sedan wouldn't. The D4 engine is mated to a very slick 6-speed automatic gearbox, which along with the all-wheel drive system gives you very, very decent performance numbers if these matter to you. So you have a 0 to 100 time of around 8.4 seconds is what I managed, and a top speed of around 210 kilometers an hour. Volvo says that it will finally phase out this engine in 2017 for a more efficient 4-cylinder motor from its Drive E family of engines. The only reason it hasn't been done yet is because Volvo is still configuring that engine with its all-wheel drive system. But until then, it isn't really a bad deal, is it? A city fuel efficiency figure of 11.1 kilometers per litre and a highway figure of 17.2 kilometers per litre is decent fuel efficiency in anyone's book. I like the fact that the steering system, despite being electrically assisted, isn't too electrically assisted, because unlike a lot of current generation cars, luxury cars that have electric systems, this at least has a lot of weight on it. So even at higher speed, despite the added ride height, you still feel very firmly planted, and that's very reassuring. So how do you increase ground clearance? Well, one way, of course, is using a bigger tire size, which Volvo have done. So instead of the 17-inch wheels that you see on the S60 sedan, the S60 Cross Country now gets 18-inch wheels with a much higher profile as well. So that does increase the ride height quite substantially. The other way, of course, is something that a lot of engineers will kind of cringe to do, which is increase the suspension travel, because that is a thing that actually hampers the dynamics. But they've had to do it just slightly. You can see the increase in the gap in the wheel wells. But now, one department that we don't give enough credit to is the chassis tuning department, the chassis engineers. And that's because they have the really difficult task of striking that fine balance between ride quality and handling. Now, we want everything, don't we? We want an added ground clearance, which essentially means that we're okay with having a higher center of gravity, but that doesn't really matter to us because we want the car to handle really well as well. So that's the job of the chassis engineers, and I think Volvo engineers have done a fantastic job in that. Even though the ride height is increased, they've managed to make the suspension a little bit stiff. So even though with the excess travel, it doesn't boat around a bit. So there's very little yawing and pitching as you would expect in a car that is this high, as you expect in SUVs. But on the other hand, on the downside, it is stiffly sprung, which essentially means the ride quality isn't as plush as you would expect in a luxury sedan. So what of the different variants? Well, there's just one actually, the Inscription Trim, which comes loaded with all the features and safety equipment offered in the standard S60 as standard. So Volvo has certainly added some value to the S60 with the cross-country variant. It now looks better, is more practical, and basically has more appeal. And at an expected launch price of about 40 lakhs, it has great value as well. So what is the S60 Cross Country? Well, is it the perfect sedan? It's probably not. Is it the replacement for an SUV, as in will it do everything that a proper SUV is supposed to do? Well, not entirely. But here's where it is important to talk about the Indian mindset. What do us Indians really want? Well, if one thing can do the job of two things, why have two things, right? Come on, admit it. And that's where the S60 Cross Country finds its raison d'etre. In fact, I would be really surprised if the S60 Cross Country even replaced the S60 sedan in India. What do you think, Sohit?